For more on the SADC summit, I'm joined from our Pretoria studios by Dr. William Mpofu, a researcher at the Wits Centre for Diversity Studies. A very good evening to you, Dr. Mpofu. Thank you so much for joining us. What's likely to top the agenda?
Oh, evening. What appears prominent and capital before SADC in the present are economic issues, which on their own are actually symptoms of the political challenges that confront not only the SADC regions, the 14 countries that are involved, but the African region at large and the global south at large. And some of these problems are not just African problems, but are world problems that are playing out in Africa, with the economy, with growing inequalities, with poverty, with unemployment, and political unrest taking the front seat.
And having said that, Dr. Mpofu, I mean, SADC's performance in upholding the civil and political, rights is very much unimpressive. I mean, such countries as Swaziland, the DRC, Zimbabwe, their performance or their approach to such social ills in those countries has been very much weak. And are you also of the view that SADC only acts only if on threats to democratic governance when stability is threatened in those countries?
Yeah, what can be observed is that African liberation movements that are projected and represented by political parties have remained exactly what Julius Nyerere complained about in the past, that at the AU level, these multilateral organizations of Africa have remained sort of clubs of tyrants that meet together to strategize on how to protect themselves from their people. There is no meaningful way in which these multilateral organizations like SADC and even the AU have shown that they are representing the people and not representing against the people. So these remain elite political clubs of powerful and privileged politicians and political organizations protecting themselves against the people and managing their people rather than governing and leading them towards the much awaited liberation that has not taken place decades and decades after Ghana, the first country in Africa to be liberated or to be decolonized, first raised its flag. So you are right to say that there is a disillusionment and disappointment.
And having said that, Mr. Mpofu, I mean, talking of Zimbabwe, I mean, the economy of that country has been on a constant, downfall. And we see Zimbabweans earlier on today taking to the streets to protest against the declining economy and as well as the high escalation of prices. How do you expect SADC to deal or to approach those issues affecting Zimbabwe?
SADC can be said to have failed the people of Africa, the people of the Southern African region, in terms of developing and actually exercising some teeth in reining in governments and states and ensuring that they abide by the codes of human rights, by the codes of good governance, and by the codes of respect for human life. What is taking place in spectacular extents in Zimbabwe is the return of colonial kinds of politics, where a government or even a faction of a political party thinks that it can govern by coercion, it can use the strong arm, and you see footage of police officers attacking members of the public that are seated down, peacefully protesting and peacefully demonstrating. And then you see police officers attacking them, beating them up, beating women, beating vulnerable people, the elderly. And then you see that we almost are going to a stage whereby we want to confirm certain colonial stereotypes of us as barbarians, of us as unthinking, and of us as uncivilized, which is tragic many decades after what was supposed to be political independence in Africa.
And as I've mentioned, SADC's approach to Zimbabwe has been pretty much weak. How do you think this time around things might improve with greater intervention from the regional bloc?
Not only the approach to Zimbabwe, but the approach to all other problems that are taking place in the Southern African region. SADC has remained an elite, privileged and powerful organization that is there to protect the rulers, not the ordinary bread eaters of Africa. And what that is doing is that it's radicalizing ordinary people of the Southern African region into more militancy, into more aggressive approaches, and into more agitated protests for human rights, for good governance, and the like. So we are going into an unfortunate situation where one can say that that dark days are back in Africa, whereby ordinary people are being forced into suicidal deportments, whereby they have to confront police officers, they have to confront armies, they have to confront governments in a sort of very, very, very aggressive approaches, which spell out further instability, further unease in the region, because the people are poor, they are dispossessed, they are not privileged, they have no access to basic resources of life. And their impatience against these states, these governments is growing. And it must be said that all these problems, as much as they are playing out in individual states, they are connected to the larger structural and systemic constraints that African countries face in the world, whereby governments cannot deliver to the needs and the expectations of the people, where decolonization itself, political independence, has not led to the liberation that the guerrillas and the liberation movements went out to fight for during the liberation struggles.
Speaking of structural constraints that I just mentioned, the trade-related illicit flows have largely been ignored in Southern African countries, and such illicit flows amount to over 30 billion US dollars, and South Africa alone loses about 5.9 billion US dollars as a result of these illicit flows. So do the customs departments or customs offices of these Southern African countries have the capacity to detect potential misinvoicing of trade transactions?
What can be said is that the nation states themselves, the governing institutions, the organizations that are in place in Africa and in the global side, were not, as they were imposed by colonialism, designed to liberate, designed to deliver, and designed to minister to the desires and the wishes of the common people of the region, but are still conduits that are used by the modern colonial world systems to keep Africa and the global south in subjection. So they do not have the capacity to deliver the liberation economically, politically, and otherwise that the ordinary people of the global south are meant to expect. So what one can say in justice is that colonialism is real, imperialism is real, and slavish interstate relations of the world are still at play in Africa. What we have in form of our governments, in form of the liberation movements, in form of our leaders, are managerial entities that are there to manage Africa on behalf of the modern colonial world system. And the symptoms are there to be witnessed by everyone that cares to look carefully.
So you reckon that SADC should lobby these rich international countries to crack down on tax havens, because Southern African countries are losing billions every year as a result of this?
Definitely, and I think SADC, AU, and other multilateral institutions of Africa and the global south should be awake to the aspirations, the needs, the wishes, and the conditions of the common people of the region, and be able to go back to their original identity as liberation movements, as guerrilla movements, as radical movements that were created in the very first place to fight for the liberation of the continent and its people, not to be managers of their people, to discipline their people on behalf of the world system. As I said before, liberation is still a project that is pending. Independence itself is still a project that is pending. All what we have, these beautiful flags, these melodious national anthems, and these wonderful leaders that we have, are all artifacts, metaphors, and symbols that are not changing the life conditions of the people of the continent. So independence is still a myth, and liberation is still what is pending.
I certainly hope that we can, look beyond those melodious anthems and those colorful flags. Dr. Mpofu, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. That was Dr. William Mpofu, the researcher at the Wits Centre for Diversity Studies, speaking to us live from our Pretoria studios and just reflecting on the SADC summit, which will get underway. It will be held in Tanzania.